We're live. Hello, interwebs, and welcome to another episode of Paul Owens and Dr. Witz's Colloquium on Games of Strategy, Episode 6 by Dixit, Skeath, and Riley. I'm Austin Smokewitz, one half of Dr. Wictz.
I'm Aaron Hanswitz, the other half of Dr. Wictz.
I'm Paul Owen.
Okay. and Dr. Wictz is proud to say that our card game, You Fool, produced by Button Shy Games, is now live at Button Shy Games. You can order it today.
Wonderful transition. Yay!
Oh, yay. That was so smooth.
And very exciting. We're all excited.
This is why Bruce from the Party Game Cast recommends you have a professional salesperson when it comes to selling.
That's right. Somebody with a good voice for radio.
Yes. Just as you need a professional graphic artist for a board game or card game. Yes, I totally agree. Professional sales.
But bums like us, you're great for designing games. So, just
right.
come to us when you need a game design.
That's right. Take it to the professionals.
So today we are going to be talking about Chapter 6, Combining Sequential and Simultaneous Moves.
Right. So far we've discussed, as we got into these games of strategy, we started off with sequential games, right? And talked about how somebody makes a decision and then that decision branches off to an opportunity for someone else to make a decision and so on. And that sequence of decisions constructed a tree with payoffs at the end. And then we talked about simultaneous move games where I make a decision that you don't know about, you make a decision I don't know about. We compare our respective choices on a matrix, and this resulting cell in the matrix determines what the payoff is of our game. And those were two pure cases, a sequential move game like chess, a simultaneous move game like rock, paper, scissors. So this chapter is our first opportunity to look at games that actually combine both structures in a single game. And it's an interesting, has some interesting ramifications when you look at that and how you can start to shift back and forth between sequential and simultaneous or integrate the two of them together in the same game. So for example, let's see, an example is there's an investment scenario where you have two companies investing in or choosing whether or not to invest in say a fiber optic network and providing a fiber optic network service, and then comes the decision of whether to price it low or price it high, and that becomes basically a sequence of simultaneous games where if it's Dr. Wictz fiber network company and Paul Owen fiber network company, and we each decide, am I going to invest or not? If neither of us decides to invest, neither of us makes any money, neither of us loses any money. If one of us invests, the other one doesn't, then the one who invested has full reign of the entire of the market and can choose a high price. So that's their two-step process. That's that sequence of a simultaneous decision followed by a sequential decision. The interesting thing comes when we both decide to invest. Now we're faced with another simultaneous move game. Do I price high? Do I price low? If I price high and you price low, I get nothing. So the Nash Equilibrium of that game is going to be we're both going to price low and we're both going to lose money. Right. And if that's the expected outcome of both investing, and you do the rollback analysis from that sequence of simultaneous move games, you end up not investing because you're only going to lose money if your competitor invests, and you can't count on your competitor not investing.
Which is a way to explain why wireless networks within the United States are still so they don't invest a lot into them, that's for sure.
Yes.
Or at least they didn't at this time. But Aaron, I understand that going back to the first edition, you have something similar but something different. Okay. Aaron, do we still have you? Oh, maybe not. Okay.
Maybe not. So while we try to find the other half of Dr. Wictz, we can talk about how changing that investment game into a sequential game, or the first decision into a sequential game, can change the outcome. So if say Dr. Wictz internet, if Dr. Wictz internet company decides to invest first, and Paul Owen waits to see what Dr. Wictz does, then I see, oh, you guys are investing. If I compete with you, I'm going to lose money. I may as well stay out. But you're in, and you've decided to invest, and now you've got the whole market yourself, and you make a ton of money. All I can do if I invest is cause us both to lose money.
Okay, so Aaron is trying to talk but cannot talk to us, and he has apparently lots of good comments that he wants to be saying right now, and he's listening to you, Paul, and he's screaming no at the screen. Hey, we got Aaron.
Got it.
Okay.
All right. So let's go back to what Paul was saying earlier about describing this. Let's bring this right to the board gaming world, because the example he described is the most realistic example we've really had in this book of describing a lot of games we play. Because most games we play are not just purely one or the other. I mean, there are examples.
Right.
Chess is purely a sequential game. Okay, maybe you can get me there. You could argue there's a lot of sequential games. But a lot of simultaneous games, they're not purely one-off simultaneous game. When I play the Resistance, we play a simultaneous game, then there's a pause, and then we play another simultaneous game in the set of sequential order.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's move away from. Economists are having fun here. We're talking about entry games. In my book, it was R&D instead of telecom. And if I want to talk more deal about telecom, that's a separate conversation. This is actually my specialty in economics. So there's a lot of reasons why there's problems with the telecom stuff, and we'll leave it at that.
So our book just simplifies the telecom problem just a wee too much.
Right.
Well, it could be one of many problems.
A subset of problems.
Subset of problems, yes. Yes. Subsets will be one of our favorite words tonight. But no, I mean, we have lots of games where you make a simultaneous move, you see the results, and then you adjust what you're doing. I mean, this is diplomacy. We make a simultaneous move of what everyone's doing in the game. We see what happens, and based on what happens, that changes our next set of moves. And if we're really good, potentially, depending on the payoff matrix, there might be a set of optimal strategies. There might be. The example in the book, which was the introductory example, they showed you that there was a specific set of Nash equilibriums. But as we know in our discussions, games don't always have a pure strategy Nash equilibrium result.
Right. Or they may be too complex to calculate what that Nash equilibrium is.
So, sorry, I just seen a cat go up in front of the screen right now.
Pay no attention.
Sweatshirt on.
Pay no attention to the cat.
But now we're starting to be in the more comfortable world of the games we actually deal with and starting to model them. Because now that we are doing these multi-step models, we aren't just thinking about the one instance and the results of that one instance. If we're being good designers, we're thinking about each step, how that step is going to influence the next step. And if someone's really skilled, the skilled players are already making those plans in the earlier stages of the game.
Right.
So
that's true.
Now I know you had some more thoughts, Paul, so I don't want to completely derail you, but I did want to push you towards, let's start thinking about the resistance. Let's start thinking about diplomacy. Let's start thinking about these simultaneous games where they step. Simultaneous
yes.
A pause, and then people have to make their next decision, and they're going to make it based on what just happened.
Resistance is a very interesting example. It's simple enough to kind of get our hands around, but it's got some great dynamics going on in anticipation of what your opponents might do and what options are available in the next move based on what you do in this move. For example, a common I'm going to say strategy or rule of thumb or whatever for a first move is if you are a spy and you have been selected to be on the first team, you always vote you never vote to sabotage the first mission.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether that's 100% rule. In fact, I'd be curious to hear if any of our listeners have counterexamples to that thinking. But it throws it's intended to throw suspicion off the two people who are on the first team. So then, of course, you get nothing except that you get a free mission for the resistance.
So you're describing the problem we brought up earlier, is that the strategy is so preordained that first stage of the game is useless in a weird way, uninteresting.
Right. Unless you are of a school of thought that says
playing the resistance.
Well, and that's how. I don't know if we want to go down this path, but that's how they solved that issue in Secret Hitler, because if you are a fascist or Hitler in the early stages of that game, it is actually beneficial to post yourself as a liberal on the good guy's side, because then when it comes to the end of the game, you might actually be considered for a leadership role as opposed to being X'd out of the leadership role, and that can make the difference between winning and losing the game at the late game.
But I need to explain to me of how is that?
Yeah,
that just sounded like the exact same thing.
Right. It's a different thing, just because in the resistance, when you get to the end game, all you're concerned about is not having the resistance members on your team, right? You're just trying to make sure that they're not on your team at the end, so that you will succeed and win the game.
Right. No spies on the mission, right?
No spies on the mission. But in Secret Hitler, you're trying to specifically not have one character on the team. And I know that sounds the same, but in practice it's not, because if that person can stay hidden and not be eliminated as, oh, you can't be allowed on the team and you can't be allowed on the team, and actually be in consideration for being on the team, then the bad guys can actually win. Whereas in the resistance, as we just learned, because it's always the play to say, oh yeah, we all succeed in the mission, that doesn't give you any information, and it really doesn't give you any information on the good guy's side.
So,
and that's not good.
The question I have is, what Paul described is in the resistance, there is no choice in your move in the first round.
If you believe that, yes. If you believe that's what
support enemy. And if you aren't, the fear being posed here, have to commit to passing the mission. And the question is, does Secret Hitler solve that same problem? Can the Nazis have an incentive to make two different decisions, or must they always hide in that first round?
There is, okay, so what they do differently is when it comes to whether or not the mission, the equivalency of a mission succeeding or not in Secret Hitler is you have a deck that is shuffled and dealt out as to whether or not, and the characters have to pick the card if they succeed or not. And the thing is that because it's a deck of cards, of one deck of cards, as opposed to each individual person involved making the decision, it is possible for the deck to just not go your way and you don't have an option. to succeed.
Hmm.
Rarer at the beginning, but it is possible. And it is possible to hide the fact that you don't have the option to succeed. But just like in the Resistance, if things fail, automatically people don't go to, oh, well, I guess the deck wasn't in your favor. They go straight to, well, somebody is obviously a traitor on that team.
Wait,
so
then goes to the same question, what is the long-term strategy? Because this is a hard problem to solve in a deduction game like this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is it always a dominant strategy to hide? If it is, how do you break that?
Mm.
But
Right. And I'm not convinced that it is. I mean, if so in particular, let's go ahead and game out the first 2 turns. If it's a 5-player game, if I'm a spy, I'm on the first team, and I vote to just sabotage the first play. So the spies have a point, basically. The next 2-player team has to consist of the other 2 out of the remaining 3 players. If my fellow spy is among those other 3 players, there's a 2/3 chance that he's going to be on the second team.
Right. So in a 5-player game, you have 3 resistance members and 2 spies.
Right.
I'm looking this up
If I sabotage the first mission, and if my teammate is on the new team and sabotages the second mission, now they have 50-50 knowledge whether I'm a spy or the other person who's on the first team, only a 33% knowledge of again, 50-50 on who's on the second team. They only know one safe player. That one safe player is going to be on every team from then on. But they basically have to guess right on really a 25% chance on the 3-man teams and 50% chance on the remaining 2-man team in the remaining 3 rounds. So I sort of feel like it's not necessarily an automatic strategy. It'd be interesting. It'd actually be interesting to kind of map that all out.
Right, because I'm just looking at it here, and they alternate between 2-person team, a 3-person team, a 2-person team, and then 2 3-person teams in a row.
Right.
And of course, with the idea being that by the time you get to the end of the game, the 3 resistance members should know who each other are, or you are most likely going to fail, lose the game.
Right. So anyway, where does that leave us with looking at combinations of sequential and simultaneous move games?
Yeah, let's loop this back then.
Right.
So
so if we look at that investment game, actually, let's look at something else. Let's pick a different example now.
Sure.
What I really wanted to get into was shoot, I'm going to have to check my notes on this because I can't remember.
Well, our book. Okay, Aaron's trying to talk again, and he can't.
Oh gosh! Wow, this is great.
Okay. All right. So, the other thing here is our book goes into the 2nd edition and 3rd edition books, loops back to the Battle of the Sexes game that we love talking about.
Oh yes, right. Actually, my book didn't go into the Battle of the Sexes.
Really?
Although I thought of it as I was taking my notes.
Because it talks about the fact about how in a sequential game, in a sequential-based game, they start to talk about first mover advantage.
Right.
Yeah. And of course, the Battle of the Sexes, as always, is the quintessential best example of how and why you want to be in why you want to be the first player in some games.
Right. Just like the investment game, if you can choose to invest before I have the opportunity to choose, and I see that you've chosen to invest, I'm motivated not to invest. So there's definitely a first mover advantage in that game.
And then, of course, they counter that with second mover advantages. Hey, so instead of going first, you get to go second, and you get to then react to what the other player is doing. Yeah.
The interesting thing that as I was mapping this all out in my head, I came up with an interesting conclusion. So if I have a, let's say 2x2 matrix type of game, if it's got one equilibrium.
Yeah. Yes, Aaron, you're starting to pop back up now.
Yes.
You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. What did I miss?
So we were just looking at different kinds of first mover, second mover advantage games. And there's a conclusion that I reached. You guys can kind of see if I'm right about this. If I have a basic 2x2 simultaneous game with a dominant strategy equilibrium, a single equilibrium, if I convert that into a sequential game, that's still going to be the payoff of the game. It doesn't matter what order we go in. The result is going to be the same. So, for example, in a prisoner's dilemma, even if Austin and I are prisoners, we're going to rat each other out if it's a simultaneous decision. If I get first decision before Austin decides, I know that if I fess up to the crime, then if I clam up, he's going to rat me out. I'm going to do the time, and he's going to get off scot-free. So I'm not going to clam up. I'm going to rat him out. Then he's going to see that I ratted him out, and he's going to rat me out. So the result is the same because it's a strong equilibrium.
Well,
second case, what if there are two equilibria, right? An example for that might be chicken, where either you swerve and I don't, and I win the game, or I swerve and you don't, and you win the game. So when it's simultaneous, there's kind of no telling what's going to happen because there are two equilibria. But if one of us makes as we talked before, a credible signal, one person gets to decide first, I'm not going to swerve. Okay, Austin, what are you going to do? Clearly, you're going to swerve. So there's a first mover advantage in that game. So my conclusion is a simultaneous game with two equilibria. If you convert it into a sequential move game, it has a first player advantage. Now, if you have a game with no stable equilibrium, let's see if I got this right. Yes, if it has no stable equilibrium, right, you're going to get a second mover advantage. And it's like the Navratilova-Everett competition, where you're either doing a down the line shot or a crossing shot. There's no equilibrium on that. But if Navratilova gets to react to Everett, Everett commits to a down the line shot, and then Navratilova can react, then the second mover has the advantage based on the first mover's decision. So if there's one equilibrium, it doesn't matter. If there's two equilibria, then there's a first mover advantage. If there's no equilibrium, then there's a second mover advantage.
So I don't think it's whether or not if there's one equilibria. With the prisoner's dilemma, it was the fact that there was dominant strategies. That no matter
that's probably more the point.
I was always better off if I made that one particular decision.
So it's a more specific case of dominant strategies rather than just any case with a single equilibrium?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'll buy that.
I mean, the great thing is it fits into the definition of dominant strategy. If you were explaining this to someone else, you would say, well, it's a dominant strategy because there is no better strategy. There's nothing that can do my strategy. And I don't know if we have to think carefully. I mean, the challenge, of course, is when you start adding multiple players, things can get a little more crazy. But at least in a two-player game, if one player has a dominant strategy, then that will push you to a single equilibrium. There can be exceptions. Someone can have a dominant strategy, and someone's indifferent between different equilibriums. In case you'd have more than one, but
so the monetary fiscal policy game is interesting from the standpoint of it has a dominant strategy for the Congress, But if you construct it as a sequential move game with the Congress moving first, you end up with a different result. And the way that happens is Congress so by way of background, the whole premise is Congress controls the budget, either a balanced budget or a deficit budget. The Fed controls the interest rates, low or high. Congress's preference is for low interest rates, first of all, but they don't control the interest rates. They do control the deficit and as a budget rather. And they also like budget deficits because their constituents like more programs. But first thing is they like low interest rates because that's good for it's good for business, it's good for loans and that kind of stuff. Conversely, the Fed prefers a balanced budget. It's better for the economy. And then secondarily prefers low interest rates because they're less inflationary. No, I'm sorry. Prefers low interest rates because they're good for the economy. You're the economist. You know better than I do. But the point is, each one is kind of primarily interested in what the other one is doing. Congress preferring low interest rates, and the Fed preferring a balanced budget. However, the deficit budget is a dominant strategy for the Congress. The Congress will default in a simultaneous move game. The Congress will default to a budget deficit because it's better in both cases, low or high interest rates, better for the Congress. And therefore, knowing that, the Fed is going to have to go with a high interest rate to avoid the inflationary results of a deficit budget. And so neither of them really gets completely what they want out of that. If you make that a sequential game, if Congress commits to a budget first, Congress says, okay, I'm looking at what the Fed is going to do after I make my decision. If I choose a balanced budget, the Fed is going to see, oh, there's no inflationary pressure. I can do low interest rates. And what I really want is low interest rates. So the Congress says, if I pass a balanced budget, the Fed can approve a low interest rate, and that's much better for my constituents, and I much prefer that result. And so does the Fed. So by making it a sequential game, with Congress going first, even though Congress has a dominant strategy, they will choose the other strategy and get a better payoff than they would have if it had been a simultaneous game. That, I think, was the most interesting thing that I got out of the whole book, that by converting that simultaneous move game with a clear equilibrium into a sequential game, the payoff was higher for both parties, and the result was not the same as the equilibrium. I thought that was very interesting. It's hard to sort of verbalize. It's a lot easier to see in graphs and pictures and stuff.
Yeah. So, Aaron, since we lost, I'm going to pause here for a moment. Aaron, if you wanted to go back and comment on anything that we were talking about before when we couldn't hear you, now would be a good time to do so. Unless we lost Aaron again. Okay. Can't hear me. Can you? No, Aaron, we cannot hear you. Okay. All right. Well, so he's going to work on his technical issues. So it is a really good example, Paul. And I do have to ask, did any board games come to mind that was able to pull off this kind of hybrid concept as you were thinking it through? Or do you consider this to be untread territory for board game designers?
Have you ever played Spartacus?
Spartacus is
a game. Each of us is a dominus, I think it's called, a high player in Rome, of course. And the idea is to get the most influence. And the interesting thing about the game is that negotiations are pretty fast and loose.
Mm-hmm.
money can change hands at any time for any reason,
Good.
and commitments can be honored or not. And things can happen sequentially. I do think everything has to happen sequentially. In other words, I can't hold money out to you and say, if you play that card, I'll give you this money. But if you don't play the card, I get the money back. It's,
Okay.
I promise you the money and you play the card, and then I honor my promise or not.
Or
I
not.
give you the money, you promise to play the card, and you play the card or not.
Okay.
There's a lot of opportunity there to change the results depending on what sequence you agree on, including you're allowed to show people cards. I'm going to play this card right here, and if you pay me $5, I'll play it on him instead, or something like that. So Spartacus is the best example I can think of where you can control the outcome of a decision tree by changing the sequence of events.
But you're also, but you're making that, you're changing that though by, well, okay, well, I guess that makes sense. You're changing that though by changing the expected reward payout. So you're not changing. So like what's interesting about this game, this Fed game, is that the payouts are set, and it's just the order of which you move that's different. What you're talking about is, as you go along, you are physically like crossing out and rewriting in the payment, the strategic box of saying like, no, yes, now I will pay you $5. No, I'll pay you $6 to do this differently, which is interesting, which is very interesting.
That's a good point.
Hello, Aaron.
I hear you.
I hear you.
You heard me?
Yes.
Whoa. What happened?
Okay. I don't know. So, okay. So now we've covered a lot of ground since you've not been able to talk. If you'd like to now go back in time and start talking about some of these things, it would be great so I could splice it in later.
Well, with the game Paul brought up, I mean, I've had to work backwards the payoffs because it wasn't in my book, but I can see how that could occur. So you're right. Having one dominant strategy is not sufficient to guarantee the sub-game perfect equilibrium in a sequential game would be a simultaneous game. It takes two. Both players have to have a dominant strategy for that to work out.
Right.
Now, Aaron, you just brought up a big phrase here, something that is bolded in our books as a key term. I think you're going to have to explain what that term is.
So
you just said sub-perfect. You just said sub-game perfect equilibrium. Is that correct?
Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. I don't know anymore. I'm sorry. I keep asking. So when you think of the game, there are lots of different steps to solving it. And you can think of those steps as being little different nodes. They can each be their own game within themselves.
Right.
Subgame perfect is let's figure out what's going to happen if in every step of the process, people always make the decision that will be in their best payout, their best interests. And if you do that, then you can reach potentially a select set of choices that will occur.
Right. So this is what we've been doing since chapter 2. So how is this different or?
Well, the reason we're bringing it up is that there could be things that happen within a game that can throw you out of the sub-game perfect equilibrium. Whether you fall for a bluff, whether you think something may be credible or non-credible, it can lead to a decision which puts you on a completely different path. And once you do that, you're no longer sub-game perfect, which doesn't mean you don't have choices to make the best of your situation. The player's assumption that the other players are playing this way
Mm-hmm.
And no longer do you have the same faith that you can just game out the entire outcome.
So it's the what happens when you're gaming with a fool question.
Product placement, well done. Actually, it doesn't have to be a fool. You know, it could be someone who wants you to think they are the fool so that they can get a better outcome for themselves. But, at least in my book, it wasn't very interested in diving into that question yet. It saw that as a future topic when it got the focus more on bluffing and credible commitments. You know, it did mention that, you know, if you could bluff someone to do something, then, you know, this starts becoming a real issue. But there are conditions that have to be met for that to be successful. And, you know, like I said, it wants to push that off for a later discussion. My book was much more interested in the idea that we're talking about sequential games, talking about simultaneous games, and sticking with our world of still pure strategy equilibriums. You can change the outcome of the games by changing the situation you're in from one type of game to the other. Paul was already bringing that up with the Fed and the Congress. But, you know, you could rethink that situation in the competitive environment. In my book, there's this big focus on an election. It was initially a sequential game. In the sequential game, the incumbent got to decide whether they're going to advertise or not advertise during the election cycle. And a potential challenger then got to decide whether or not they're going to enter or not enter into that election. In the sequential game version, the incumbent was going to be able to, let's see, I'm just figuring out the equilibrium right now.
Math on the fly.
Yeah, math on the fly, that's right. The incumbent always had to run ads, and the entrant would always stay out of the race.
Right. Yep.
Hmm.
A little bit like the fiber optic network problem, where if you choose to invest first, I'm not inclined to invest.
Yes. But if the other player, the challenger, could somehow find a way to change this from a sequential game to a simultaneous game, then there was a whole new equilibrium. Because when that happened, the gray player had a dominant strategy to never run ads. So the incumbent had a dominant strategy to never run ads. And the green player, which is the person entering the market to run for the office,
Mm-hmm.
would then have a strategy to enter the race. And that was a higher payoff for them than the sequential game.
Hmm.
And so, because the different game types create different winners or losers, it creates a metagame of what type of game we're playing. And it creates a challenge for board game designers, because good players are going to see this in a design, and they're going to try to game the system to put themselves in the game that will make them win or have a better chance of winning. And you can go either direction, whether you're going from a sequential game to a simultaneous game or a simultaneous game to a sequential game. I mean, there's another example in this book about entrance for retail outlets, where there was a rural location and an urban location. And with the urban location, it was best for all companies if there was only 2 people there and not 3, so it's a 3-player game. And the rural location, my payoff matrix here. It was great if 3 people showed up to the rural location, but 2 of them would be better if they were at the urban location. And there was another minor important payout where one of those 3 giants, even if all 3 of them went to the urban location, the other 2 would do well and they wouldn't. And in the sequential game, there was one equilibrium. And that equilibrium was really good for 2 of the players and not the best for the 3rd player. But if that game could be forced to be a simultaneous game, then that changed how the game was going to play, and now this 3rd player had a shot of a better outcome. And that outcome, when you do this, there might be explicitly a set of equilibrium. So when we talked about the entry game for voting, and the person who's going to run ads or not run ads, and the person who is going to enter or not enter the election, there were 1 Nash Equilibrium based on if it was a simultaneous game or a sequential game. Or you could have outcomes where there might be no equilibriums, there might be multiple equilibriums, but as long as those situations are still a better situation for players in a zero-sum game than the equilibrium if it doesn't change, they have an incentive to metagame and to manipulate the game, which means players try to find ways when they play your games to change your game, even if that was not what you intended to happen, because it fits the interest they need to achieve. I mean, I think we can think of a lot of games where players try to make actions that change the game to their advantage. Try to change it from being a sequential game or simultaneous game. I think of the player who puts down their card and says, "I'm doing this already." That's one way of trying to change a simultaneous game to a sequential game.
Right.
Or I can see players where it's supposed to be a sequential game to say, "Look, let's just all reveal at the same time." Again, they're doing the same thing. They're changing the game, and when they do that, they are changing potentially what is the equilibrium. And if they're doing it well, they're doing it to their advantage.
So as designers, that is a thing we have to be cognizant. As designers, that's a thing we have to be aware of as we're ratcheting down our rule sets to try to find where the points in our game could potentially be open for rules lawyers and players who are trying to take advantage of our systems.
You're still. I agree. We have to worry about it, but I wouldn't be as technical as you say it.
Okay. Because it's also possible that things are intentionally left vague to allow for said play.
That's true. But some of it is just going to be what's the culture that your gamers play.
And I do have to ask, does this lend credence to the idea of creating more asymmetrical games so that you have the potential for players trying to manipulate the game in specific ways to bring it to their advantage?
Well, yes, but that means the skilled players will start asking, well, why do you want to be sequential? Why do you want to be simultaneous? And if you do sequential, I mean, sequential has the extra complication, the first and second mover advantage. I mean, just think of kicking penalty goals in soccer. Let's say we made it a sequential game. Do you want the first mover or the second mover? Do you want me to go, if you're to go into kicker, do you want me the first mover or the second mover? Sequential game, penalty shootout.
Right. Right. So going back to my hypothesis, since there's two equilibria, no, there's no equilibrium, then you prefer to be the second mover. You prefer to react to what your opponent does and then do the opposite if you're the kicker, or do the same if you're the goalie.
Yeah. But once it's a sequential game, there are equilibriums. It just happens.
Once it's a sequential game, right.
The first.
As a simultaneous game, it has no equilibrium.
Yes. And that's the magic of the strategy. You know, once you're playing that game, you're trying to create the situation that's to your advantage. If you know you're going to be the second mover in the sequential game, you're trying to make this into a sequential game. And if you know you're going to be the first mover in the sequential game, you're doing your darndest to make it into a simultaneous game.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes.
Okay.
So, I mean, this is like the biggest takeaway from this chapter, is this ability to transform how your game works just by what seems to some people maybe innocent little decisions.
I mean, in terms of what order do players make their moves, or what do you do simultaneously instead of sequentially? Even if all the actions are the same, even if all the decision options are the same.
Who gets to go first? Who gets to go second? And what information you have at the time of making your move, makes a big difference.
Does someone even go first?
Do I play my card face up, and my opponent gets to make a decision based on what I played, or do I play my card face down, and my opponent has to decide what to play before he sees what I play? In other words, so that it's a simultaneous move in that case.
And exactly, you know, you can see how people, unless you're really strong in your rule set, they have to be really strong. You know, there's to be the person that says, look, let's say, guys, right now, I don't want to mess around. Here's what I'm doing. They put the card up. And we might think initially, well, that's pretty innocent. But if we really think about it, that's not pretty innocent. That's pretty manipulative. The opposite of innocent. They have just messed with the rule set to give them the advantage in the game. And they are successful because they went first. And unless people decide they care about something other than just winning, which they might. I'll bring that up in a moment. They're stuck. Now, the might's important here because metagaming changes things. And part of metagaming is you're playing something more than once.
Right.
Do we consider playing a game per person a second time the extension of this game theory? In which case, we now have rational reasons to respond to that person who is the game, to punish them, in an attempt to influence their behavior in the next game.
Another example kind of came to mind. If I think of pool as strictly a game of skill, let's suppose I'm playing a series of games of pool with you. And the only decision I'm making is how much money to bet on the next game. If we're treating it strictly a game of skill, we're each going to play as well as we can. I'm assuming we're each going to play as well as we can. And maybe the amount of money I bet is going to base on, I'm going to base the amount of money I bet on how confident I am in beating you in the next game. I might base that decision on how well I did in the previous game. But now that might motivate you not to play your best game first. In other words, to try to hustle me and make me think that you're not such a great player and then jack up the bet and beat me in the second or third game.
Which, again, starts bringing us to the later discussion of what is a credible commitment. You've seen how this is
Right.
this important topic that's going to come and smack us all in the face. But you're also starting to see this has important implications, and implications that we purposely put ourselves in situations to experience. Paul, you've been to the World Board Gaming Championships. You have dealt with different types of tournament plays.
Right.
You have, in essence, a game, a pause, another game,
Right.
pause, another game. I mean, or we could talk about NBA games. My team has already secured a position in the playoffs. How do I play the game I'm playing right now if I'm thinking about the championship?
Right.
Or talking about a very famous paper in economics about sumo wrestlers. Are you guys familiar with this?
No.
I believe I've heard of some interesting shenanigans going on in the sumo world. Yes.
Shenanigans.
Shenanigans. There is shenanigans.
I always thought it was the most honorable of sports.
So
Well,
what they found is that, let's say, Paul, you're facing Austin. And Paul, you've already secured your position to make it to the next round. But Austin hasn't. You need to win one more match.
mm-hmm.
All right.
I'm about to be eliminated. If you beat me, I'm going to be out. I'm going to be out.
But regardless
I'm
of
going
the
to
result,
fall below
I'm
the
in.
line. That's right. No matter what happens, you're in. But
And does my seed change depending on whether I win or lose?
I don't know enough to tell you that.
Okay.
I think it's just a ranking issue. Like you're in a division or you're out of a division.
Oh, I see.
Right?
I see.
So I'm about to get. If I lose one more match, I'm going to be kicked out of this division. But you are very secure.
I'm in. Okay. Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Who wins?
I win. It's close. It's close, but I win. Thank you.
So let me think about that. What's my motivation? I guess I'm most concerned about not injuring myself for the next round. Is that true? Is that my primary concern? I know because I think about this in terms of the NFL, they tend not to play their starters if they've secured a playoff berth and home field advantage because they don't want to injure them. Or is there another consideration in sumo wrestling I'm not taking into account?
So I'm pulling up the article right now.
Yeah, there's the reason why I say shenanigans is that I believe there was another angle to this story as well, because they found that this practice was happening too frequently. And so
the underdog would win by a slight margin disproportionately often. Right. And you know, in some cases, if you just looked at it from a purely mathematical way, you could even say that there might be some honor in it, in this idea of, I'm not just going to crush somebody. However,
what the paper suggests is that if I help you get into the next round now, when you're in the bubble in the future and you're facing me, I will reciprocate the favor.
Interesting. So I'm basically forming an alliance for the next round. After a fashion.
Future point, yes.
Yes, a little bit of unsportsman collusion going on.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
And then, of course, I believe there was a money angle to this as well, because people do bet on these games. But
I never betting on human athletes. Horses I'll bet on, never people.
Right, because the horses don't have a person riding them trying to tell them how to do things. Right. Because the horses just ignore that jockey on their back. Forget you. I'm running faster now.
I think, Paul, you're down to Greyhound.
Right. Yeah, you're down to the Greyhounds now.
Down to the Greyhounds, right? No jockeys on Greyhounds, right?
Little ponies. Run little ponies.
So I think we should summarize.
Mm-hmm.
We've identified how the construct of a game can affect its outcome, and how we would analyze games that are essentially hybrids of simultaneous and sequential games, and what happens when you change a simultaneous into a sequential or vice versa.
And I will ask the same question to Aaron that I asked to Paul. Aaron, do any games come to mind when we talk about the switching between simultaneous and sequential in the game itself? I know that you brought up examples of how people would try to game a system to make it one way or the other, but do any games come to your mind that have that as a natural part of the game, or is this more untread territory for game designers?
I don't know.
That's fair.
It sounds like a design opportunity.
Yeah. So, anyway, Paul, you were summarizing.
Yes. So we didn't get into the 3-player game case, I don't think. Maybe we discussed it briefly. But yeah. So I think, like I said, I found it very interesting how you can change the outcome by changing a simultaneous game to sequential. Also interesting how you can analyze a game as a series of simultaneous games, or that kind of, or changing order of play. So yeah, and I appreciate the Aaron's effort to tie us into how does this actually affect real game design? What can we do in terms of the way we construct our games to, I guess, protect against players who manipulate the construct of the game, and what circumstances might we create first mover advantage or second mover advantage, and maybe what, if we assuming that we want to avoid those, what kind of tools do we have at our disposal to avoid those?
Right. So definitely for anybody out there listening, look into this and see if any ideas come to mind as you design your next game. So do you have any other points, Paul?
So I can think of a really good example of a game that is a sequence of simultaneous move games. And that's one where each player has a card and chooses essentially where you try to manipulate order and manipulate the what your opponents are doing, and then you're doing that as a sequence of essentially smaller games, and that is a game in which there's only one loser and everybody else wins, and that would be You Fool by Dr.Wictz.
You don't say.
A clever little micro game, a great little study in game design, and up at Button Shy Games.
Right, at buttonshygames.com. And what's really interesting is that as I was playing this yesterday, somebody was like, hey, this is there's a little bit of a 3-door Monty going on here. And I go, yes, except and in a way, just like 3-door Monty, you have one player who's sitting there going, oh, but behind this card is this, and you have to go,
a goat over here.
It's there's something with 4 legs over here, and you go, well, now, wonder what that could be.
That's right.
and it's a little bit of that. But now you have not just somebody doing it for entertainment purposes. You have somebody who has the game on the line for themselves.
Yes.
So great. Buttonshygames.com. You fool. And that's going to wrap it up for this episode of our colloquium on games of strategy by Dixit, Skeath, and Riley. Coming up next is the next chapter is my chapter 7 is Simultaneous Move Games with Mixed Strategies 1, Zero-Sum Games. And I have to say, this is a beast of a chapter. This is like a good 50-some pages in my book.
Goodness, yeah. My chapter 7 is also fairly lengthy. It looks like it's 50 pages, and the title is slightly different. Simultaneous Move Games with Mixed Strategies 1, 2x2 games.
2x2 games.
And it includes subsection on zero-sum games, and then also goes into non-zero-sum games.
Okay.
Now, the actual chapter itself looks like it's 25 pages, and then there's a lengthy appendix apparently on probability algebras.
Okay, so that might be what that's all about.
Yeah.
And I believe at this point we're finally catching up. I think we're finally catching up to Aaron in his book, because they break it, they slow it down for us later on, but I think we're finally catching up to Aaron, so I'm sure he will have a lot more to say as we move forward. So
all right.
I don't typed up an intro, did not type up an outro.
So my name is Paul Owen, best known on the internet for Dice Tower News. You can follow me on Twitter at Paul Owen Games. Although I haven't written much lately, I do have a blog, paulowengames.blogspot.com. My intention, my next several posts will essentially be summaries of the last several chapters we've been discussing in Games of Strategy. So we'll actually have some kind of a written summary of these discussions we've been doing over the last several episodes. And I can be reached on Board Game Geek. My user ID there is PDOwen3.
And of course, you can follow Aaron and I at Dr.Wictz. You can find us online at dr.wictz.com. And yes, you can find us online at dr.wictz.com. And you can also find us on Facebook at Dr. Wictz Games.
And how do you spell Dr. Wictz?
That's right. It's Dr. Wictz. So you can find us online at dr.wictz.com. That's dr.wictz.com. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and I want to say see you in the next one, but that's also, I think that's taken on the interwebs. wictz.com, technically. Okay. All right. And I'm just going to stop the broadcast. Yeah.